Did you know that you pay millions of dollars every year to subsidize drug abuse in the state of Idaho? It sounds absurd, but it's true. This is just what the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare is doing through an obscure, woke nonprofit called the Idaho Harm Reduction Project. Legislators thought that this was absurd too, even redirecting federal funds from this group to first responders instead. But after 4 months of the fiscal year, the Idaho Harm Reduction Project is still being funded, and first responders aren't receiving any support for obtaining Narcan. We discuss this issue and how it affects Idahoans and what the legislature should do about it on this week's episode of Fiscal Fridays. So what is all this about federal funds for so-called harm reduction programs? In 2019, the Idaho legislature passed a law that allowed there to be a private group to operate needle exchange programs throughout the state. If you are an Idahoan that recently moved from leftist territories like Oregon, Washington, and California, this sounds familiar to you. The program is designed to provide clean needles, drug paraphernalia, condoms, and HIV testing in the guise of offering a pipeline for treatment. These services are all free to the user, or that is, funded by the taxpayer. Idaho's harm reduction program goes even further. There is a whole website where the state brokers sending your drug paraphernalia in the mail. They even have resources for those interested in so-called gender clinics and free sex supplies. The Idaho Harm Reduction Project is the main player in this scheme, receiving about $1.8 million annually. In fact, the organization is essentially an off-the-books state agency, with 94% of all of its funding coming from government grants. It is a woke organization, paying more than $18,000 in sponsorships for things like the Boise Pride Festival, honoring the experience of sex workers, and providing needles for those who need to inject gender transition drugs. Until this year, first responders had to go through this woke nonprofit to access Narcan for emergency opioid overdose reversal. Budget writers in the legislature decided it was absurd to subsidize the activities of the Idaho Harm Reduction Project with tax dollars. Thus, they redirected more federal funds for first responders throughout the state. However, because the money can no longer be laundered through woke groups, the Department of Health and Welfare is struggling to fund Narcan distribution through first responders. But in the meantime, the Idaho Harm Reduction Project is still going strong. Unfazed by the loss of funding for the program, the IDHW decided to move funds from federal HIV grants to continue supporting the organization. With all this, the IDHW is at odds with the goals of the legislature. Mind you that there is no legal mandate for the legislature to provide funding to support harm reduction programs throughout the state. It merely states that they can exist. The legislature knew this and saw the funding as an inappropriate expense, but the IDHW felt differently and is openly defying the legislature like they have in other funding decisions and parameters. The solution to this bureaucracy gone rogue is this: cut federal funding, provide accountability, and institute measures to prevent state funds from supporting these programs. This means directly addressing the misuse of public funds within the department. It means reducing the number of federal grants that are not called for in Idaho policy. Finally, it means the legislature must put restrictions on appropriations. It is imperative for legislators to rein in this behavior of Idaho's permanent establishment. There is no longer any accountability to the people, allowing leftist policies to creep into the gem state. This must stop. In all, the IDHW has decreed that it is important for you to fund drug abuse in Idaho, but these programs are at best ineffective and more likely dangerous to Idahoans. The legislature must put a stop to these leftist policies that have crept into the state budget without their oversight. This is crucial to prevent the rogue bureaucracy from subverting the conservative principles of governance that make Idaho a great place to live, work, and raise a family. For more episodes of Fiscal Fridays or other great content from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, please visit idahofreedom.org.